Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This is an acoustic bass guitar. We already talked about the electric bass guitar. It's only fitting that we talk about the acoustic variation of it. Now, a lot of times people will misnomer a stand-up or double bass as an acoustic bass, but this, in actuality, looking like an acoustic guitar with the 4-string, sometimes more, is what actually is referred to as an acoustic bass guitar, or an ABG if you cool. Now, this instrument is based off of a lot of other instruments, namely the double bass, the electric bass, and more importantly, something called the guitarron. The guitarron is one of my favorite instruments in the world. I don't have one, I've never touched one, never played one, I've always wanted one. I remember being like 14 years old and seeing a mariachi band play for the very first time in my life, and seeing this guy had this massive fucking guitarron, which is like a bass guitar, but it's thick as shit, and it's 6 strings, and it just sounded absolutely amazing. And I've wanted one ever since. I just never got one. One day. Interesting though that the guitarron is often defined as being created in the 1960s, but we have historical evidence and proof of it being around since the 1890s. Idea of that instrument to this one, there's still a gap there. Now, there are tons of different acoustic bass guitars. General idea, whether it be the Leon or the guitarron or any of the other versions exist in the world, most of them coming from Latin America. To get to the very specific model that we see in front of us, shaped the way it is, truly modeled after the modern steel-stringed acoustic guitar, the journey kind of starts in the 1930s. Remember from a previous episode, the electric bass was created in the 1930s, but so was something else called the basso guitar. Now, the basso guitar had a very similar model to this. It looked like a guitar, but it was a bass. Problem was, it was like 6.5 feet fucking tall, and it was played upright, not transversely. The first modern acoustic bass guitar, the idea of what you see in front of you, happens in 1955 by the K Company in Chicago. Really, the instrument finds its stride in the 1970s, when Ernie Ball goes to Tijuana, sees a guitarron for the first time, and is like, we need that. If there's an electric bass for an electric guitar, we need to have an acoustic bass for an acoustic guitar, because we're still dealing with like flower power and all that shit and a lot of acoustic music. So let's create an instrument that fits that mold. So he bought a guitarron, lucky bastard, brought it home and fucked with it until he came up with this idea. It was semi-popular in the 70s, especially the late 70s, and sort of fell off the map again until the late 80s. And it was a television show that revitalized interest in the instrument. That television show was MTV Unplugged. Look, MTV isn't what it used to be by any means. It was something at a point called the MTV Bump. MTV used to have a lot of concerts, whether it be the Headbangers Ball or the Unplugged shows. After any of these concerts, sales would sort of skyrocket for whatever artist was being profiled. Interesting thing also happened. After the Unplugged concerts, not only would sales of compact discs and vinyl and cassette tapes skyrocket, all that's really old, I felt old saying that sentence, but also sales of specific instruments that were being used. If Kurt Cobain was playing an Ibanez, people would have bought a fucking Ibanez. Vast majority of these concerts were intended to have an unplugged sound. Most of the basses opted for acoustic basses. So seeing these televised concerts, the escalation of sales in acoustic bass guitars made them again a prominent feature in the music store scene. Don't get me wrong, in no way is this trying to do what a double bass does. Instead, it's trying to do what the 12-string steel guitar did. Remember, the 12-string steel guitar was invented as a complement to another instrument, a complement to the banjo, and this was invented as a complement to the acoustic guitar. Load up on guns and bring your friends. It's fun to lose and to pretend. If you want to hear some great music using this instrument, I highly recommend you check out a YouTube channel called CC Bass. It's this awesome lady who plays some amazing bass guitars and regular guitars as well. She has a great collection. She sort of shows them off and isn't afraid to look like weird when trying to figure out a new instrument. And that's my favorite part of it. The humility that she has is absolutely fucking incredible. Don't get me wrong, she's incredible, but every now and then you'll hear her go, oh fuck, that sounded terrible. And then just keep playing. And it's absolutely wonderful. You should totally go check her out. You're super cool. Thanks for being you. Day 61 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This is what's known as an auto harp. It is a part of the zither family, and because it's a part of the zither family, it's a part of the psaltery family. Because it's a part of the psaltery family, it's a part of the string family. Because it's a part of the string family, it's part of string theory? I don't know. I ran out of steam. Take a look at how pretty it is. This one, it's seen better days. I bought it at like a thrift store, and I've been sort of working with it and trying to rebuild it and stuff like that. It's a little out of tune. It's a little hard for it to stay in tune, but it's getting there. It's so sort of cool, and I wanted to show her off today. This instrument was originally created, or sort of, in 1882 by a German immigrant to Philadelphia named Charles F. Zimmerman. Charles F. Zimmerman sought a patent for something called the auto harp. It was basically a zither that what could happen was you could press a lever that would dampen certain strings in order to form chords. It's the same sort of principle that we have going on right here, but the difference was that when he was using it, the mechanism to dampen the strings didn't come from above, but instead from the side. In 1883, that a native German musician still in Germany by the name of Karl Guter invented something called the Volkszither, which is the people's zither. It was this design that you currently see in front of you. It's a moderately successful instrument, so successful in fact, that it's made its way to America. And in 1885, Charles Zimmerman started selling that design. But when he sold it, he put his name on it as the designer and his patent number, which is shady as fuck. For years, there's been this debate about who created the instrument, and I'll let you sort of decide. But that's not going to be the only controversial aspect of this instrument, which is kind of surprising and crazy. In 1926, Oscar Schmidt fell in love with this instrument. He decided to trademark the name auto harp, but through a clerical error, he only trademarked his specific logo for auto harp. For 50 years, nobody knew there was an error, so it wasn't until the 1970s that this was revealed, and other people could start using the term auto harp to describe their instrument. Also in the 70s, that the first pickup gets inserted into this instrument so that it can be acoustic electric, but it's in 1981 that a fully electronic version of this instrument is created called the omnichord. Omnichord is the instrument used to create the Gorillaz song Clint Eastwood. Like the entire fucking song, like that whole music, all of the music is just a straight up plug-in. You mash one button and it plays that song. So that's kind of insane. Go research that. You're gonna be impressed. Originally, the instrument was designed to be played much the same way that other zithers are played, in your lap. The idea was that you hold it like this, the left hand would go across the instrument, and you would only strum in that corner, right? It's even got little legs on it to this very day to make sure it sits on the table. But it's only in the 1950s that Cecil Null becomes super famous and popular for deciding to hold the instrument like this. And the notion was the left hand would still do the chording, but the right hand would play up here. If I were a fish and you caught me, you say, look at that fish shivering in the sun. Such a rare one, can't believe that you caught one. If I were a fish and you caught me, you say, look at that fish, heaviest in the sea. You win, first prize if you caught me. Why is everybody on the internet so mean? Why is everybody so scared of what they never seen? If I was strolling along and I saw me flopping around and singing my songs, say damn they're cute, they're not sing along. despite the fact that it has a shit ton of strings and it involves some sharps and flats and everything like that, it's still classified as a diatonic instrument because it does not include the entire chromatic scale. It spans about 3.5 octaves, but it is selective in the notes that it applies because it still wants to be able to utilize the specific chords. You probably know this instrument a lot from country or folk music, if you know it at all. June Carter Cash and the Carter family are super famous for playing this instrument, so you could totally check out some of their stuff because it's absolutely awesome. But if you want to hear some great music using this instrument, I highly recommend you check out Trixie Mattel, the famous drag queen artist, incredible musician in their own right. They utilize this instrument for some amazing stuff, both really sincere songs and comedic songs as well. So fuck all these anti-drag laws. That's my stance on that. Thank you so much for joining us, day 62 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Thank you, everybody. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This is what's known as a recorder, or an English flute. Now this is both known as an aerophone, a fipple flute, and a duct flute, which is one of the oldest forms of flute that we have in the world. The duct flute or fipple flute date back to Neolithic prehistory, but this flute itself, the recorder, takes its origins in roughly the medieval time period. We don't really know how old the instrument is, but we have, interestingly enough, a bunch of different pinpoints where we can find where it's being played at, by who throughout history. The oldest mention of the recorder by the name recorder is in 1388. Time though, the recorder was a lot bigger, it was a lot thicker. Ladies, hit me up. Recorder itself is kind of an interesting story about how it gets it. At least the word recorder and record have some interesting records unto themselves. It originally derives from the Latin word recordare, meaning memory. That shifts to something called recordor, which is the old French version of to memorize, to put into one's heart. In 1066, with the Battle of Hastings, rise of William the Conqueror, two groups of languages merged in a really intense way. The old Germanic languages of English and the French languages sort of just smashed into each other really hard. Initially, a lot of words were changed, and then over the next couple of centuries, as lines of territories were drawn, we would see influences coming back and forth, and words constantly over the next few hundred years evolving, changing their meaning, borrowing from one another, and stuff like that. 1300s, this had adopted the Latin-inspired French term recorder amongst the Germanic people that were in England and the vast majority of the Germanic regions. However, in the French-speaking world, it was still called a flaut, or a flute. In English, meanwhile, the word recorder or record would become the term for when birds sang. And it's unknown whether it was because of this instrument or the other way around. Late 1400s, as more French words flood England again, the word flute is introduced, and we start using it to describe the transverse flute. We have to find a way to distinguish this instrument from that, so people started calling it the English flute. And in medieval England, Italy, Germany, and France, this was the #1 instrument. Moving from medieval times, not just the restaurant, but into the Renaissance, this would maintain its popularity as the single most popular instrument. And all sorts of public figures were known to play this. Like Henry the fucking VIII was a recorder player. William Shakespeare played the recorder. In medieval time periods, it was popular for minstrels of the court to play this instrument. Now, when I say minstrels of the court, and I'm talking about this time period, it's very different than the idea of minstrels in the American history. Expectations of minstrel performers in medieval times, almost like a jester, were expected to be basically the vaudevillian performers of their day, able to do anything: dance, play music, recite poetry, tell jokes, all of that stuff. And the recorder was an easy instrument to carry around with you and was said to have a beautiful angelic quality. A good span of about 400 years, this is considered the most beautiful sound on earth. Up into the Baroque music period, this was considered the benchmark of society. Like, You know, if someone tells you they don't have a Netflix or they don't even use somebody else's Netflix password, you kind of give them like a side eye of like, who the fuck are you? That's the same sort of mentality that would happen if someone said they didn't play the recorder. Composers like Bach, Handel, they all wrote pieces specifically for the recorder. For some reason, in the classical period and the romantic period, the recorder just kind of falls off. People stop talking about it. In the turn of the 20th century, that the idea of playing the recorder becomes popular again. But it's not like the trombone because of school, but we will get to that in a second. Classical music and concert music at the time starts taking an interest in historical music, looking back at different fads and different crazes that had happened, let's say 250 years ago. And in that search for old school music, they find this guy. In the 1950s, a man by the name of Carl Orff listens to all of these wonderful touring virtuosos playing recorders in some of the biggest spaces in the fucking world, and he creates something of his own, Orff Schulwerk didactic system. He'll later publish 5 volumes, Music for Kinder, Music for Kids, between 1954 and 1958. In it, he will talk about the importance of playing the recorder and all of the benefits it can form for the young growing mind. It's because of this publication in 1954, a fucking world of education bows down to the teat that is the recorder. Recorders start to be made in bakelite, which is a hard plastic. They're made cheap. You can ship them everywhere, and voila, you get an instrument. The recorder itself comes in many different variations, whether they be tuned in the key of F, tuned in the key of C, or the alto, tenor, soprano, all different types of recorders. But it's very important to remember that when we're talking about the recorder as an instrument specifically, calling it a soprano is not the equivalent of talking about a soprano singer. They do not have the same range. Instead, it's only referring to the recorder itself. This is a soprano in comparison to the alto recorder. Makes sense? The recorder operates the same way as the tin whistle as far as blowing here. We also have an octave key on the back. Make sense? The recorder surprisingly has 5 regular notes and then 2 split notes. The 6th and the 7th note each have 2 holes there, meaning it allows me to do semi-covered notes, making something sharp or flat only to a certain extent. I grew up in a poor school, so we didn't have recorders or anything like that. So I kind of missed out on that train, but it is a super fucking fun instrument. And it's sort of classic, you know what I mean? There's a lot of rich history to it. Plus, I love the idea that the name itself means memories. And now, somehow, we found a way to go full circle so that for so many people, this is a memory unto itself of playing this when you were young. Kind of cool. If you want to hear some great music using this instrument, I highly recommend you check out this band from the 70s called Sour Cream. Now, there's a lot of different bands called Sour Cream, but this one was just 3 dudes playing recorders, and it was fucking awesome. Go check them out. And also check yourself out, because you looking fine as fuck today, day 63 of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about these motherfuckers. These are what are referred to as castanets. Form of clapper. We talked about clapper a little bit when we talked about zills, an idiophone percussive instrument that dates back to, and the ideas of clappers go back to ancient times, whether they be in Egypt or in Greece. We see them bleed their way into modern times with instruments like the zills that we already discussed, or in minstrel shows, the bones were played in the same variation that clappers would typically be played. Also, the clave is technically a clapper. There's also an instrument called the fucking clapper, but these are the castanets. We can date these back specifically to roughly 1100. They are popular within the Spanish world, Spanish-speaking world, specifically, more importantly, in Spain and España itself. Castanets is the diminutive of the Spanish word castaña, which is the Spanish word for chestnut, right? Which these kind of look like. They're made out of wood, 2 pieces of wood that you clamp together to make the noise, right? They're used for a lot of traditional Spanish music, like a sevillana, which is a Spanish folk dance, or a escuela bolera, which is more like a ballet dance developed from Spain, as an accompanying percussive instrument. But they're also used in flamenco. Flamenco is a popular variety of Spanish music, but in Andalusia, these are called palillos, which is also the name that they take when we're talking about them within the world of flamenco. One of the other notable places that the castanets in specific are used is in the late Ottoman Empire. We believe it makes its way to the Ottoman Empire through Spain and its connection to the Moorish people, but in specific, it's a group in the Ottoman Empire called the Kocheks, which are slaves at the time, but they were typically Romani, and they were typically the most attractive of the slaves and of the Romani that would dress in drag and play these for entertainment. And it was considered a way to potentially get out of slavery because it was such an important art and craft of the time period. How do you play the instrument? Well, the idea is that you have a band around your thumb. You try to get the instrument sort of deposited into the palm of your hand, and so that the rest of your hand can just come down like that, often using your index finger to help make the Pac-Man face it's doing. A lot of dancers and singers will utilize this instrument to help keep them in time, and it's just a fun little way to add accents and percussive elements to what you're doing. And they are playing it for the musical advantage of the instrument. We'll have two different sizes of castanets. That way it gives a different pitch to one of the instruments. Variations all across the world of what these instruments can be made out of. Plastic to metal to bone, but the castanet in its typical form is supposed to resemble something like a chestnut, so wood is always the preferred method. If you want to hear some great music using this instrument, I have a different sort of recommendation for you today. I highly recommend you go check out videos of a specific dancer named Carmen Amaya. Carmen Amaya is considered the queen of the flamenco dance. Now remember, in flamenco, these are not called castanets. She is absolutely amazing with these and the way she moves. Plus, you'll get to hear some of the incredible flamenco music and see how her movements and her percussive elements of the castanets, or palillo, sort of help contribute to that sound. Thank you for contributing to this. Look, I would probably do this anyway, whether not anybody's watching, but anytime I see somebody like or comment or share or just view these videos, it just makes me feel like I'm not screaming into a void, like I'm not doing something for nothing. It's a personal challenge, but it's nice too to see that it affects other people in a positive way. So you affect me in a positive way. Thank you so much. Day 64 of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. It's what's known as a thunder tube, a thunder stick, or a thunder drum. It is a tube with a membrane on the end and a spring attached to that. It is an indirectly struck idiophone. It can be played a couple of ways. One is just to shake it. The increasing intensity makes the sound even louder. We can also play with the spring. There's a noise that's created there, but then also the quicker we pluck at it, the more specific that noise becomes. We can also hit it to make that sound, or while shaking it, create sort of a wah effect, the way the automaton sort of operated. Now, there are two different conjectures about how this instrument comes into being, and it's sort of hard to figure out which one is true. School of thought says that this instrument is based on a Native American tradition of indigenous people of America with no specific tribe cited, but that the idea of the thunder drum is an old one. Before the existence of a spring, it was twine that was tightly strung together and then released to create the same sort of sound effect. And then in the 1960s, Remo Belli, the founder of the Remo Drum Corporation, sort of took that idea and modernized it. The same way we have the vibroslap as a modernization of the jawbone. So that's one school of thought. The second school of thought is that Remo Belli just sort of invented it. in my research to find a Native American or indigenous version of this instrument, all I can find are modern people creating it on like Etsy that are telling that story to help sell things. I couldn't find any old examples of an indigenous version of this instrument. But that doesn't mean that it's not out there, because this is one of the cursed things about history, is that so much of it has been lost. And so much of it is so underreported, right? Especially when it comes to ostracized and minority groups. So there is the potential that it is something that was based on something more indigenous and more ancient. And however, there is also the potential that someone's making their own version of it and trying to sell it off of a story. You know what I mean? It's sort of like a wonder of physics. Here's how it operates. We have three main sections of the instrument itself. One being the spring, second being a thinner membrane that is easily pierceable. That's what the spring is attached to. And then third, we have the tube. What happens when I manipulate the spring? Let's say I do the pluck method. The spring vibrates, sending a wave that bounces into the membrane. Now, it passes through the membrane, creating a specific sound, and that sound reverberates in the hollow tube, thus creating the illusion of thunder. Thunder! Thunder tubes! Ho! Wonderful way to utilize and orchestrate and musicalize thunder itself. If you want to hear some great music that probably inspired this instrument, regardless of which story you believe, then I highly recommend you go outside. Listen, go outside. It doesn't matter what the weather is, whether it's rainy, whether it's sunny, whether it's snowing. Dress accordingly, find shelter, close your eyes, sit somewhere. Sit on a chair, in a hammock, on a couch. Why do you have the couch outside? I don't know. I'm not going to judge, though. Just close your eyes and listen to the sounds all around you. Look, music exists because we first heard music elsewhere. We first heard music outside of ourselves. We heard sounds and attempted to replicate those sounds. And through that, we constructed melody, we constructed harmony, we constructed rhythm. This is a sound of nature that we are trying to empower ourselves with. We are trying to put it in our own hands. Not because we are trying to be gods, but because that sound is something worth replicating. There is a beauty in it. So yeah, so today's recommendation is all like hippie. Go outside, listen around, see what music you find. Thank you so much for joining day 65 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. It's what's known as a djembe. I was playing it pretty hardcore a second ago, but like I have to hold it between my legs, so I didn't want you to just stare at my crotch. I have a whole other 100 days planned for that. Djembe is a West African idiophone, membranophone, a drum, and one of the coolest fucking instruments in the world. This is a tiny like desktop version. I have an iOS version somewhere. That was dumb. That was dumb. I've had this one for a long, long time. I kind of think when I'm done with this 100 days thing, I'm going to buy myself like a big ass fucking cool djembe. That'll be my like little present to myself. Its traditional form, it is a rope-tuned drum. Bambara people have a phrase that goes, Ajeje Ajebe, gather together in peace. That phrase is where the drum gets its name. Jebe, djembe, peace gathering drum. As opposed to what we normally think about tuning, the tightness of the rope does affect the pitch, but more than anything, it actually affects the loudness of the drum. Anthropologists, mostly African anthropologists, have theorized that this might indicate that it originated as a mortar. Modern versions that you can buy at like Guitar Center will get rid of the rope and have key tuning instead. More modern African versions will have motorcycle tires over the bottom, just slits of them, right? Prevent the djembe from moving while you're playing it. And again, like most African drums, it is hollow on the bottom. It's often cited as being the African equivalent of the tabla, and I can totally see why. There's a lot of similarities. One, to play this instrument, same way that the tabla has a specification about how it is to be played, so does the djembe. There are 25 strikes said to be used by masters. Most people only master 3 of those strikes. But the true djembe fola, the word for djembe player, really understands how to use all 25 of those different sonic strikes. Djembe fola, as we go from country to country that has this instrument, will change its meaning. Guinea, the country probably most famous for having this instrument, Anybody is a djembe fola if you just play the instrument. But in some more reserved countries, to be a djembe fola, you must play as a master. Like you're Michael Jordan on a fucking drum. You know what I mean? What about the origins? Where does this instrument come from? Well, much like the tabla, we don't really know. There are three potential origins that most people will cite, opposed to it being a specificity of the person or of the time, like year-wise that it was invented. It's just sort of like a general vibe. We think these people kind of did it, or we think it happened sort of here. This instrument has long been associated with the Mandinka people, but specifically a certain Mandinka caste. So it's often believed that the Numu, the Mandinka caste of blacksmiths, were the people that created this instrument. Now, let me explain a little bit about the Mandinka caste system. It fluctuates the way it operates throughout history. Sometimes it is seen as a higher tier. This person's better than this person's better than this person. But I heard one expert describe it sort of like a game of D&D, which is nerdy, but I think it's kind of interesting. Caste within the culture will have a benefit to it and a downfall to it. That caste will have associated with it an entire subculture unto themselves. So the Numu were the caste of blacksmiths. And for a long period of time, and still to a degree today, Numu people are often seen as being magical, as having some otherworldly quality to them. And when people include African culture in fantasy, they will often use the imagery and the likeness of the Numu as their translation into an alchemist or a necromancer. Even the anime Castlevania has an African character, and he fits every single marking for the Numu. There's also an X-Men character named Gentle, who is, he's a mutant from Wakanda, but he has like the face paint of Numu. If you're a fan of cryptozoology or like ghost stories and shit like that, there is an African creature that's basically the equivalent of a werewolf, but it's a were-hyena. And oftentimes in persecutions, people would often suspect the Numu, whoever the Numu of the town was, or the Numu's people, as being the were-hyena. That was always the first person we suspect. There are other castes within the African system, and especially the Mandinka culture itself. Griot, you might have heard of before. Griot is a poet or a storyteller. You've seen the film Black Panther. Griot is the name of Shuri's AI, voiced by Trevor Noah. But the cast of Griot seems to carry with it a bit more of sophistication. So if we're going back to our D&D model, the Griot would be the bard, while the Numu would be the mage. Some of these castes, when it comes to their culture, have things that are only exclusive to them. For example, let's talk about instrumentation. The griot is the only person allowed to play the balafon, which is like a xylophone, like a weird wooden xylophone thing. That I have one. We'll probably talk about that later. In addition to that, a lot of different African stringed instruments are only allowed to be played by the griot, but anybody can play the djembe. In most West African culture, it is considered sacrilegious for a female to play the djembe. And the vast majority of those beliefs come or originate from the Mandinka people. So it is a theory that this came from them as well. The second theory is that it comes from the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire was massive, covering from Guinea to Senegal, all sorts of countries in different places. In African culture, this instrument is often associated with that specific empire or their reign. So a second theory is that it was bred during that time period, thus explaining why it exists in so many different countries. And the third idea is that it just originated sometime after that. Either way, it's been around for a long time. But to Western culture, it's kind of a fucking new thing. The vast majority of the past 500 years, West Africa was colonized and was under the rule of other people. Thus, all of their innovations, all of their artistry was kept internalized and not allowed to be exported. Why? Because they were being exploited by other people. Looking at you, everyone. But as the countries of West Africa begin to become free, start seeing a dispersion of African music and African ideas all across the world. In 1952, Fadiba Keita started something called Les Ballets Africaines, which was a traveling troupe that performed djembe. Started off all male. Idea was to show the world African music. And this was encouraged by the first ever president of Guinea, who saw this as the diplomatic step forward. In fact, a vast majority of Africa followed, finding different instruments that represented them as a country and exporting ballet troupes, as they would call them, all across Europe to educate people about Africa. But one of the key things that they did was separate the instruments and the music from the religion. The word fetish is a very interesting word. And no, this is not 100 Days of Fet Life. Fetish means two things. That we sexually desire, and two, object related to something otherworldly, often supernatural or demonic. Haunted doll is considered a fetish. That's what that is called, right? That doesn't mean I want to fuck the haunted doll, though it depends on what the doll looks like, what her personality is, all that stuff. But the fetishization of African people in both senses have been going on for a millennia. Whether it be the objectification of them as lovers or the fear of them being the other. At the turn of the century, into the 1950s, into the 1960s, and even to a large extent today, a vast majority of the world thinks of Africa as huts and mysteries of dark voodoo and bullshit like that. Don't get me wrong. There are huts somewhere, I guess. There are mysteries. There are religions. But the dark, evil cloud of fetishization or demonizing that occurred when thinking of Africa had to be battled. African leaders in the 50s and 60s saw that the best way to do this was, okay, let's give it to them in the most secular way possible. It wouldn't be until 2007 Ballet Africain would introduce female djembe fola and eventually get an all-female troupe. And though a revered instrument in African culture, the djembe has become more popular in the West than it has in Africa itself. In fact, it's featured in more recordings every year from America alone than it is the rest of the world combined. If you want to hear some great music using this instrument, then I highly recommend you check out a man by the name of Mamady Keita. His name is spelled, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, Mamadykeita. An absolutely phenomenal djembe fola. There's been documentaries made about him. He's absolutely incredible. Go check him out to hear some absolutely fantastic music. You're fantastic as well. I'm so glad we got to spend this time together. God, I love it. Look forward to it every day. Well, not 5 days a week at least. Day 66 of 100 days of musical instruments. Bye, everybody. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This is what's known as a toy piano. See, it is modeled after an upright piano, but toy pianos come in all sorts of designs, and a lot of them with different types of mechanisms, and they could be modeled after baby grand pianos, after upright pianos, any sort of design there that you want. Earlier toy pianos had keys entirely made out of wood. The earliest, dating back to the mid-19th century, the sharps and the flats keys, or the accidental keys, weren't actually keys at all, but just pieces of fixed wood not meant to be played, thus meaning that the instrument at the time was diatonic. This, however, is chromatic, and all of the notes play. However, even though it's called a toy piano, it doesn't actually operate the same way that a piano does. Piano, as we discussed before, has strings that are hit by a hammer. However, the modern toy piano plays more like an instrument called a celesta. A celesta has metal tubing or metal rods that are struck by a hammer, and that's the way that the vast majority of toy pianos operate. When they were originally conceived, it was glass tubes, so the sound was a little bit more crisp. You had to be a little bit more delicate and all of that sort of stuff. But it's in 1886, Albert Schoenert develops the metal system that would really define the toy piano sound. He moves to the United States of America. His father in Germany had been a toy maker, but he gets a different job with a toy maker in the States. And by 1935, he creates his own company, the Schoenert Piano Company, specializes in toy pianos. In 1935, he publishes a catalog of 10 pages of toy pianos. Well, 9 pages of toy pianos, 1 page of toy piano stools. It was one of the hottest toys on the market at the time. Prices ranging from 25 cents to $25. Nowadays, some of these can go for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. You probably know the instrument, music that you've heard. If you're like me, you grew up watching Charlie Brown, the Peanuts, the character Schroeder. this is what he played, was a toy piano. You can see it covers right at 2 octaves, a little bit over it. In the 1950s, people started experimenting with different ways to make the toy piano produce its sound. There were even some inventions that had toy organs that operated very similarly. There was even temporarily a pianolodeon, which actually had strings in it and operated the same way a real piano does, but very compressed. It didn't really catch on. In the 1970s, the two leading producers of toy pianos were the Show-Nut Company that we previously mentioned and Jamar. In the 80s, Jamar would buy out Show-Nut, but keep them as two separate lines being produced. In the 1990s, financial situations had hit rough, so the company was forced to close down. However, they would emerge a couple years later, sacrificing the Jamar part of it and just going with Show-Nut, which is still the leading producer of toy pianos. In 2007, in San Diego, Toy Piano Festival began. It's an annual event where toy piano players from across the world get together. They perform concerts, they have seminars, new albums are released. It's kind of fucking insane. It's a whole world. And people seeing how much of a world it was encouraged Library of Congress to adopt this guy as one of the key factors of music and culture. Now, you've heard this instrument in tons of songs, whether it be Radiohead, The Beatles, Tom Waits, Jeffrey Butler plays it a lot, John Mayer, Your Body is a Wonderland, it's in that. This thing is everywhere, and knowing the sound, you're gonna hear it more and more. But if you wanna hear some great music using this instrument, then I highly recommend you check out John Cage, A Suite for Toy Piano. It is experimental. It's written in the 1940s. There are tons of different recordings of it, even his recording of it. It is weird and it is fun and tests what the limitations of the instrument are. It's a fun thing to play. I really love this guy. I found this motherfucker in a thrift shop for $20, which is a fucking steal. No one else feels like a crime. Getting to hang out with you. Like, have you ever had such a good time, you feel like, oh, am I gonna get in trouble for this? That's what I feel like every day we're together. Is it the chemistry? I don't know. Day 67 of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. This right here is what's known as a canjo. Play on the term banjo and the fact that it uses a fucking can as its resonator. It's a one-stringed fretted instrument that belongs to the string family that was created in roughly 1990. The idea of a makeshift instrument isn't a new one. We've already talked about things like the cigar box guitar, but the earliest versions of like lyres and stuff were made from turtle shells. So the idea of found instruments, repurposing things that you just have lying around, is as old as music itself. There's old variations of different sort of makeshift one-stringed instruments or multi-stringed instruments, even using a can. But this particular model of the canjo was first made, like I said, in 1990 by Herschel R. Brown, the man who was a building contractor for a living and had a hobby of creating mountain dulcimers. And he was just bored fucking around his house, put a string and a stick and a Mountain Dew can together and created a really cool-ass instrument. Now, though he did patent the instrument, one of my favorite parts of the story was he gave it to everyone for free. He said anyone can create this that they want to. He'd tell everybody he knew how to make them. He would go to conventions to show people how to make them. And with the invention of the internet, just kept putting instructions online. He made a specialty of handcrafting the instrument and giving it to children or the elderly just to help them keep dexterity. For everybody else, made like do-it-yourself kits that he could send out to people and they could make their own canjo. Spirit of helping people through music and your own ingenuity is just something I heavily admire. It's a really fun instrument to play. Here it's diatonic. It is fretted, amplified, electric, so it's plugged in. It's got a can. It's a cool ass can that serves as my little resonator. You can hear that how the amplification works. It's just a fun little instrument to play and kind of a novelty. I don't think a lot of people know about this guy. And that makes sense because it is relatively new in the whole scheme of things. Although very few things created in 1990 can be called new, but this guy can. Inexpensive. It's a cool little strumming thing to play. My rabbit seems to like it a lot. I play it for her a lot. I want to hear some great music using this instrument. One of Brown's best friends was a guy named Canjo John. C-A-N-G-O-E John. You'll often see the spelling of the instrument spelled different ways. This one's C-A-N-J-O. But Canjo John is kind of world famous for playing this instrument. It's also in his fucking name, so it's gotta be, you know what I mean? It would be terrible if he was a trumpeter. You know, he's played it at the Grand Ole Opry, all sorts of places. He tours the world playing this instrument, and he has some really cool licks and stuff that he does with it. He plays it super fucking high, but that is one of the things about the instrument. It's like weird to figure out where you want to play it from, because if I'm playing it like a regular guitar, it's sort of, I don't want to crush the can, so I often like have to play it like a bass, just like perch something like a raptor sort of thing. I don't know. It's fun. Go check him out playing it. He does some great riffs and melodies with it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Day 68 of 100 Days of Musical Instruments. Bye, everybody. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. What's known as a vuvuzela. What you're saying, it looks like a plastic horn. But that's just because you're fucking young and you don't remember the World Cup in 2010. This was the loudest fucking thing back in my day. You kids, you don't even know loud. This instrument is a South African aerophone, and technically it is classified, even though it is plastic, as a trumpet. Now, the idea of a collapsible horn is a popular one. It's existed in South America since the 1950s. America, there used to be a huge fad of them in the 1960s for sporting events, and they were called stadium horns or party horns. It really takes a lot of its cues from bugles back in the day. It is a singular sounded instrument with no valves, no buttons, meaning it can only produce its natural harmonics, whether that be the sound we've been hearing, the or lower, maybe higher. No, I can't go any higher. Can you play it high up? The same way that we were playing trumpet and the bugle and the trombone with our embouchures making our little buzz. It's sort of hard to determine when this instrument became popular or even when it was created. But one man, a man by the name of Freddie Maka, says that he created it in 1965 to support his favorite South African football team. That he made it out of a bicycle horn and some tubing. Photographs of him playing it at games in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, up until the 2000s when it became a huge hit. It is considered a huge part of the South African culture, especially the South African football culture. Popular thing for hip-hop artists, especially around that time in the 2010s, to be seen in their videos just holding these things. Part of that is because the world became super aware of them in 2010 when the World Cup was held there in South Africa. The sound of the vuvuzela, especially when it's being played by dozens and dozens and hundreds and thousands of people, is considered a bombastic, loud, overpowering sound. When a global spotlight was put onto South Africa specifically, and this tradition caused more controversy than you could even fucking believe. In fact, to this day, this is the singular most banned instrument in the entire world. There are more regulations in the United States alone about this instrument than there are firearms. Where when the games were televised, sometimes you couldn't hear the commentators because this instrument hit such a frequency that it fucked up the microphones, caused a change in mass production of the instrument, changing the mouthpiece to be a little bit smaller, therefore dampening the sound of the instrument itself. That being said, you can barely bring an instrument like this into any sporting arena in the fucking world now. The two places that seem to sort of still embrace it are South Africa and Iran. Very few songs actually incorporate the instrument. More often when they do, they use it as a sample utilized within the beat itself. For that reason, I want you to check out two different songs if you want to hear some great music using this instrument. First is by a group called Radio and Weasel Good Life, and it's called Heart Attack. The second is by the Boondocks Gang, and it's called Vuvuzela. If you listen to those beats, you can hear that B-flat drone sampled throughout both songs. Cool, interesting instrument, and it makes me feel, for a second, really fucking old. 2010 was 13 years ago. Jesus Christ, fuck. Thank you so much for joining day 69, nice, of 100 days of musical instruments. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining for another day of musical instruments. Today we're going to be talking about this motherfucker. Right here is what's known as a piano horn. It's a toy musical instrument that falls within a family of musical instruments that we already discussed, the melodica. You remember this dude? Like Vin Diesel said, it's all my family, I am Groot. This piano horn, product of the Schilling Toy Company, and was started being created in the 1970s. But as far as the history of the instrument itself, I have no fucking idea. It's really hard to look up stuff about this. I kind of think it's from the 1960s or the late 70s when this thing was invented. The Schilling Company seems to be like the premier version of it, but there are other companies in England and some like sus websites that say it was in the late 50s, early 60s, all that sort of stuff. It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly when this instrument originated. I bought this at Cracker Barrel, and it was like $12. You can get it for like $10 on Amazon. It's a cool-ass instrument. Let's talk about it. Now, it operates just like the melodica or a harmonica in the fact that it's a double reed instrument. If I'm blowing on the instrument and not pressing down the key, we get no sound. It has a cool little thumb hole back there. And I press something down, sounds like the Amelie soundtrack. Notice it is plastic all the way through. It is stopped. There is no actual hole, just the hole up top. That's what she said. And despite the fact that the keys sort of try to suggest a chromatic aspect to it, it is not a chromatic instrument. Instead, it is a diatonic instrument. I get the idea that these are supposed to make you think of the white and the black keys of a piano, but they do not correspond to the same. It is just a C scale in the key of starting with a G. That's what it is, right? Yep. There's your C. What might be interesting, since we have two instruments that are very similar, is to play them side by side so you can sort of hear what the difference is, and we can kind of discuss it. So I think this should be a D. On that F is when we go a little bit. So we can hear how they get a little bit more disparate on certain notes. But that D is pretty close to one another. One of the things I want to point out is, let me just play the notes singularly by themselves. So the D on the melodica, that's me playing with the dynamics as well, versus the D here. I feel personally that this one's a little bit warmer than this one. That this one feels a little bit more hollow than the melodica. I have a little bit more control of the dynamics as far as this goes. I can go a little bit softer, but still maintain the note. This one is all, it still can control some of those dynamics, but you can hear a little bit more of the breath bleeding through there. What I do find to be easier to play because I'm not having to worry about the chromatic aspect. I tend to, when I'm playing this, feel the need to look down and sort of figure out where I am on the keyboard. But as opposed to this one, since it is a diatonic scale, I know it's pretty easy to get to resolution because I only need to go to the third, to the fifth, the fourth, or the eighth, right? If I were composing something, you know, what would be the difference in dynamic of why I would use a specific instrument over a different one? For the melodica, I would use it for any like lead or anything that was going to be sentimental. If it has to be sweet and nuanced, I'm going to go with that instrument because it gives me a little bit more control. But if I need something that's going to become a riff or a bed, I would use this, hands down, over it. Why? Because I actually have less dynamic control over this. And I know that seems like a negative, and in some aspects it is, but if I want that thing to sound the same, over and over again, I have more of a likelihood of that happening with this instrument than I do with this one. In fact, the first time I was ever aware of this instrument, I went to a Residents concert, and there's a song that they're supposed to be playing with a harmonica, or at least I always thought it was a harmonica, but the guy pulled out this thing, and it was fucking insane to me that it had always been this, but my brain had associated it as a harmonica. Now, again, they have a lot of similarities. It is still a double-reeded instrument. I think in context, we put together sounds as what we think they are in our brain, right? Alfred Hitchcock once did this experiment when he was teaching a film course about the idea of montage. Montage is putting multiple visuals together to help tell a story. We sort of bastardize it now, modern cinema, because we think of montage as a series of events, like Rocky. It's like a training montage to show the transaction of time. But in original cinema context, it was just one picture with another. It's the basic elements of editing, right? So Hitchcock would show a picture of a man's eyes and then show a picture of an oncoming train. And because our brains want to solve mysteries at all times, we instantly associate that the man's eyes are looking at the train and the train is coming towards him. That's a story that we fill in all by ourselves. We hear a sound at times and sometimes just instantly think, oh, well, that's this instrument. That's how they're achieving it. When sometimes it's fucking a toy that they bought at Cracker Barrel for $12. Harmonica has a lot more control to it, a lot more things that I can do from it. But this is simple, it's fun, it's easy, it still has a great sound, and I absolutely love this thing. It's just a great buy that's super cheap. That's why my recommendation today is going to be a little weird. If you want to hear some great music using this instrument, go make some. Google it. You can find all sorts of people playing really cool stuff about it. There's a group of girls that are, I think, PG Kelsey 22 or something like that they do tons of videos of them playing like John Williams scores, because he tends to play in major with this guy, and it's absolutely fantastic. But this instrument is under $20 on Amazon. If you ever wanted a gateway into music, this is a great way to do it, because it's bare bones, stripped down, teaching you melody, teaching you how notes work together in a diatonic scale. Easy to play. It doesn't require a lot of thought to it. You just blow and push a key. It's technically a horn. It is not a piano, but it's pretty fun. Thank you so much for joining day 70 of 100 days of musical instruments. Bye, everybody.